Hey, I'm Nick DiMatteo, and welcome to Season 8, Episode 12 of Music is Not a Genre. Do it with me, MxG. This week's topic is The Great Producers, Part 3, the 1970s, all about that bass. Now, you're going to notice something a little bit different. For this episode and the episodes moving forward, I have recorded a new mid-roll, and I just did it. And it was frankly very frustrating because I did many takes, and I don't like to edit, so I like to do it in one take from beginning to end without a mistake. It took about 10 tries. I finally did it. But what that means for you is instead of me doing my spiel here at the beginning, thank you for watching and listening, go to this website, go to that website, like, share, subscribe, rate, review, all of that. I am going to mention very little to nothing of that and allow the mid-roll to do the talking from now on, except for a podfast and certain other episodes where I will need to mention it because there is no mid-roll. So that means that I can get into the topic more quickly, but that also means that I really hope that you do stick around for the mid-roll whenever that happens, because that information is really important to me. It's really important to help support this show and the other things I do, as it is for all indie creators. So that's kind of what this is, taking the place of that right now, is basically what I'm saying. The only thing I will mention up front here is if I have released new music, which right now I haven't. My Christmas song happened a couple of weeks or months ago, whatever it was. I am working on a new project called Valley of the Unreleased, but right now it is completely unreleased. I've done a couple of songs and that's it. I plan on doing a whole bunch this year, and as those singles and that album comes out, I will keep you up to date and announce you there, when that happens. But otherwise, nothing else. And yeah, mid-roll is going to have the rest of that spiel, which thank you for listening to that. There's some really good information there. Please do. And let's get right into it then, right? So the title and topic, again, The Great Producers Part 3, the 1970s, all about that bass. This is the third part of my producer series, and of course it will be on the 1970s. And what I mean by the all about that bass subtitle is this. So as recording technology developed, which is something I go over in each of these episodes, one of the major changes was the ability to more accurately capture bass frequencies. And we're going to get into that and how that affects the music, both in the creation and the production, how it affects listeners as well. It's more interesting than you might think, which I think everything is more interesting than you might think. The show format, I'm going to go over the technology and music changes that happened in the decade. Then I'm going to spotlight the producers, and then conclusions, including my favorite producers and some other tidbits there. The featured song, as always, and questions. And then, of course, this week's bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre is one you might be like, why that topic? It's on somebody named Sylvia Robinson. If you know her, you know why I would dedicate a bonus MxTRA to her and why she's relevant to the 1970s. If not, I will just tell you here she was a producer, musician, singer, songwriter, executive, and all-around music pioneer. You will hear me mention her again later in reference to her production work, but as far as her full story, which is incredibly fascinating, go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre and you will find it there. I always include the link to the bonus in every episode. Sources for this episode: Wikipedia, Google, gearspace.com, and musicradar.com. Disclaimers. As always, while my producer choices aren't arbitrary, far from arbitrary, they are probably incomplete and they're probably biased to a degree. Again, most great producers worked in more than one decade, so what I try to do is include them in the decade in which they made the biggest impact. I haven't always gotten that right, and I probably will mess it up here and there. If that happens, I will mention them again in a subsequent decade, and I'll mention them in the concluding episode, summary episode of this series. I will go into some of the tech to illustrate how it affected the music as far as an overview of those tech changes, but I'm not going to make it so detailed that this is a tech episode. That's something I may do in the future, but this is, again, an overview of production in the 1970s. So that said, let's just get into the next section, which is technology and music changes. So first, technology developments. As you would expect, recording technology continued to advance and expand as it always does. While 16 tracks were being used from around 1967 on, they were not the standard until the 1970s. Part of that was economics, and part was, it takes time for new technology to disseminate. 24-track systems came about at around that same time in the late 60s, but took longer to become the standard. Again, probably economics, and also because they weren't seen as strictly necessary, since most acts could achieve what they needed on 16 tracks or less. So why refit your studio with 24 tracks when 16 tracks will do just fine? But by the mid to late 70s, 24 was pretty much the standard. 32 and 40 track systems were also developed in the 1970s, but they were never commonly used. And you got to figure that by the time these were even remotely affordable, or people were considering, well, maybe we need that many tracks, whether it was music development or whatever other reasons, digital recording had taken over, which of course is a couple decades after this. Speaking of which, digital recording, these next two recording formats wouldn't come into play in big ways until the 80s and 90s, respectively, but both were invented in the 1970s. So home multi-track systems, so like 4-track recorders, Tascam and TIAC and stuff. I believe TIAC was the first. It happened in the very early part of the decade, around 1972. And again, didn't really disseminate widely until the 1980s, although people were using them, and professionals as well, by the late 70s. Digital multi-tracking started in the late 70s, and of course was around in the 80s, but didn't become the standard until, frankly, the mid-90s, really, if not later. The 90s, very interesting transitional decade, and we'll get there in a couple of episodes. Another development that deserves mention, and it's what gives this episode its subtitle. And to get there, I'm going to take you on a journey. So a fan, commented on part 2 of this series, which was on the 1960s, in reference to a short clip I posted about how only some 1960s recordings hold up to today's standards, and little to no recordings before that decade do. Some do, like in jazz, classical, but most don't. The former sounds as fresh as ever. The ones that hold up sound like something that could have been recorded today. And the latter we would classify as, that sounds like old music. It sounds dusty. It doesn't have as much presence, etc. And this guy's comment was that it would be cool to spotlight which recordings hold up to today's standards and why. So since this is not a tech series in particular, as far as the producers go, and it's not dedicated strictly to just recording, there's no real place for that kind of a deep dive and a survey into which songs hold up and which don't, although it was an amazing suggestion, especially considering the guy's background. And it's something I may do, at some point in the future. But it also may not be necessary, because I can help you figure out, other than through your ears, not just which recordings sound as fresh today as any of today's recordings, even if they were recorded decades ago, but why. And I can sum it up fairly quickly. And this is somewhat of a catch-up from the first 2 episodes, because I did mention these tech developments, but it's worth it because it leads to my main point. So, number 1, better microphones. Number 2, better mic placement and use of the room space. Number 3, better understanding of what good sound capturing entails in general, separation, no clipping or distortion, etc. How to EQ things in terms of, if bass was overwhelming or if the treble was too tinny, etc. Number 4, of course, more tracks, so less bouncing, so less degradation. And number 5, more outboard equipment to add things like reverb, chorus, flange, additional EQ, other enhancements. Dolby A and later B, both created in the 60s, but not in widespread use until the 1970s. Severely reduced tape hiss and other unwanted noise. So these are huge developments. And in fact, all of those were created and even somewhat used in the 1960s, but were standard by the 1970s. Number 6, increased ability to capture bass frequencies. All about that bass. So when you listen to remastered versions of old music that was initially recorded well, say just about all of the Beatles catalog, when they remaster, there are two things you notice. The second thing you notice, and you may think this is the first thing, but I disagree. The second thing you notice is probably how much cleaner and clearer it is. They were able to break the stems down and separate it, do enhancements, EQ it better, etc. Especially since AI has made it so much easier to separate those elements that were originally recorded on a single track or bounced. But I would argue that that's the second thing you notice, and the first thing you notice when you hear a remastered old recording is how much more bass there is. Much more bottom, how boomier it is, how it has more thump and presence, even if you can't put words to that. The greater presence of the old song that hits you is 90% because of the bass. It's all about that bass, or 90% about that bass. I feel like if that song was it's 90% about that bass, no treble, 10% treble, wouldn't have been as big of a hit. So let's just say it's all about that bass. And you can go and listen to old recordings that were remastered or not remastered and tell me now if you're hearing that. So my answer to that guy might have been all 6 points above, but it could very easily just have been number 6, because the change in bass is what we notice the most. If this series were only on music recording and not the producers, I could have rightfully subtitled it Follow the Bass or something like that, like the entire series, because the biggest change in the sound of recorded music from the 30s and 40s up until at least I would say the 2000s and 2010s, made a correction, was the increased presence of bass, or the consideration of how much bass there should be. I did an episode a while back on music formats, and I talked about how limited non-digital formats were when it came to capturing the full frequency range that human ears can pick up, and limited especially in space. And I got a lot of pushback on it, of course, because vinyl lovers will insist there's nothing better than vinyl. Good for you. But the truth is that vinyl is unable to contain bass frequencies below a certain level, say 60 hertz, without severely limiting playing time, because the bass needs more groove room, more space. It would take up more space, so there would be way fewer songs, etc. And the thump would often actually make the needle jump, so it's impractical to have had that much bass on a vinyl record. That said, bass has been part of popular music since at least the jazz era, and in live settings by the 1970s. In terms of the presence, subwoofers enabled people to hear much, much, much more of it. And this segues perfectly into the music developments section of this section. It's the sections of sections. Why? Because I've said quite often that technology drives art as much as art drives technology. They each influence each other back and forth. And here's another case where I think this is true. If bass developments hadn't occurred, it's likely that other music developments would have lagged or not occurred at all. I'd say more lagged, though, because, things that artists want to happen and producers want to happen, they're going to happen eventually. Where there's a will, there's a way. They would have eventually figured something out, but the lag time would have been much greater. And either way, some of the main genre developments in the 1970s wouldn't have happened quite so definitively, and maybe not have had as big an impact without the big bass presence. Think of heavy funk, fusion, disco, and other forms of dance music, electronic music, hip-hop, even heavy metal and other big-bottomed rock, including a lot of progressive rock. Much of those genres wouldn't have been what they were without those bass developments happening first. And they also relied on one other huge development, the rise and widespread use of synths and drum machines and other electronically generated music elements. So keeping all this in mind, it makes sense that most of the major music developments of the decade were shaped around the tech and increasingly affordable tech at hand. Though the rise of funk in the late 1960s was significant, absolutely 100%, it's hard to compare that era's funk impact with the incredible array of funk and the beefiness of funk in the 1970s, how hard it hit. Same with anything considered danceable music, whether it's disco or other electronic, whatever. Today, there's no question we hear original disco tracks as comparatively thin. Have you ever listened to an unremastered disco track and been like, how could people have danced to that? The bass is barely present. Bass, the kick drum, whatever it is, they dance to it. Believe me. And in a live setting, they would have heard the bass a lot more. But in the recording, unremastered, yeah. Very interesting. For their time, they were thumping, but of course that would all get more and more so from the mid to late 70s on up and through today. Same with fusion and anything tinged with fusion. Speaking of tinged with fusion, progressive rock would not have been what it was without the availability of what? 16 and 24 track recorders, especially 24 track recorders. Heavy metal wouldn't have been as heavy without the bass. Krautrock wouldn't have been a thing without electronic instruments. You think of Can and Neu and Kraftwerk and all of that. And hip hop wouldn't have been at all anything without all of these elements and turntables and how, the use of instruments or technology as an instrument. In many ways, and you're going to disagree with me on this if you're a rockist, hip hop was the culmination of all of the tech developments of the decade. If you don't agree, that's okay. And I'm going to try to explain why. Think about it. Other than the need for 16 or 24 tracks, which wouldn't really happen in hip hop until the late 80s, really, when there were a lot more layers. Hip hop was able to be what it initially was in the 1970s because of developments in bass capture and electronic instruments. It stemmed from the technological changes available to the creators and the ability for artists and producers to record their own tracks on home systems, also developed in the 70s. So as we get into the great producers of the decade, you can be sure I will include some hip-hop producers too. In fact, I categorized them this time around, so we're going to hear that. And not only are we going to hear it, we're going to hear it right now as I take an audible drink, because again, I don't stop or edit. Cool, clear water. Yes, wonderful, wonderful thing. Let's get into the next section, producers of the 1970s. So it's true for everything ever, everything and every creature that evolution creates more complexity, both in the micro and the macro. And let's stick specifically to music. That means this. In the micro, so within any given genre, more complexity arises in that genre, both because there are more tech options and because artists and producers do more experimenting and mixing of styles, etc., bringing in other elements. Plus, no matter how pessimistic some of us are about the public's ability to absorb and appreciate complex music, that's not true. There are people out there, I know you right now, saying today's music is so simplistic. It's not like, the complex music of yesteryear that was so, rich and full and deep and meaningful. Not true. It's not true. When you listen to pop music from many, many decades ago, you will find that it has less complexity because we weren't as used to it. And it's been said, I think in a progressive rock book that I read and some other places, that progressive rock and other progressive elements in music have infiltrated all of music. And I think that's true. Music across the board has gotten more complex, with the possible exception of pop country, something I don't talk about often. And so the average pop song today has actually been heavily influenced by progressive music notions and electronics and all the other changes we've been discussing. So that's the micro. And in the macro evolution, complexity, what started out as hillbilly music, this is an example, what started out as hillbilly music became country and western, and became all the various versions of country and western, whether it's the folk, pop folk, the Bakersfield sound, the Nashville sound, all that stuff. I did an episode on all that. You can check out. That's the history of country music. In other words, genres beget subgenres and subgenres and on and on and on. Rock and roll turned into rhythm and blues, which became soul and then funk and then disco and hip hop. But rock and roll also begat rock and prog and fusion and the dozens of other and probably hundreds of other subgenres of rock. So that's that macro complexity. And I say all this because as this series advances, it's going to become harder to do a couple of things. First, it's going to become harder for me to narrow down the list of producers to include because, the industry grows, population in general grows, the amount of people involved in the music world grows, the amount of recorded and released music grows. I'm going to try to keep each list in each decade about the same size. So that means I'm going to have to eliminate far more in the future than previous. And the second thing that's harder to do is to organize this list, because the law of evolution means every decade sees a further explosion and expansion of music on the whole. So for this part 3, I'm going to introduce subcategories, as I mentioned. And as I mentioned in the disclaimers, I won't be able to cover every great producer. So some favorites of yours might be left out, some people you think deserve recognition that I might have missed. But I feel like this is still a pretty representative list, fairly comprehensive. So I'm going to try to create some kind of logical flow from one global genre to the next, but we'll see how that goes. You can, as you know, music is not a genre, so you can flow from one genre to an unexpected other genre and it would still work, but you know what I'm saying. So the first category here, I'm just going to call rock, but it can also be considered experimental music and the offshoots of rock, album-oriented production. And some of the great producers of the 1970s, one would be Jimmy Page. As Led Zeppelin's producer, and he did produce Led Zeppelin's music, and he was also a session musician, and I think maybe, I don't know if he was a co-producer in name, but did some co-production. Prior to Led Zeppelin's formation, he was a session musician for years and years and years in the 60s, before, Led Zeppelin formed. Then, of course, Yardbirds and his other stuff, right? He helped define what heavy rock would sound like. Massive drum sounds, layered guitars, strategic use of ambience, dynamic contrast. You have the acoustic, soft, and then it goes big and all of this. And so many of the things we think of as the palette of hard rock and even heavy metal came from Jimmy Page's work. Another guy, Bob Ezrin. And again, most of these are guys. It's just the way of the world, certainly in the 1970s. Not all of them, though. Bob Ezrin is known for his theatrical high-concept rock productions for people like Alice Cooper, Pink Floyd's The Wall, Kiss. He emphasized narrative structure and cinematic arrangements. So when you think of big music, and not deep, not full and hard like the Jimmy Page, but that big kind of theatrical music, you have Bob Ezrin in part to thank for that. Glyn Johns was the master of naturalistic rock recording. He did minimal mixing, minimal drum miking. He wanted that authenticity, the live sound to come from the recording, emphasis on a live feel. And that defined an era, really, in rock. People like the Rolling Stones, The Who, and even Led Zeppelin. And so many of those other bands that wanted that quote-unquote authenticity, which, I've done authenticity in music is an illusion. Like everything is authentic or nothing is. And some might be more truer to the artist than others or truer to a certain sound. But authenticity is in some ways a false term, but meaning that kind of raw sound, capturing the instruments in the room. Glyn Johns was a big purveyor of that in the 70s. Completely different angle, Brian Eno, who pioneered ambient music and using the studio as an instrument, which all of these people have had influence in subsequent decades on subsequent producers and music and artists. But there's an argument to be made that everyone I mentioned so far, Brian Eno has had the biggest impact because so much of what we hear in every single genre has these ambient elements to it and uses the studio as an instrument. So he worked with, of course, Roxy Music, which he was a part of for a while, David Bowie's Berlin Trilogy, Talking Heads in the 70s. And he helped reshape how atmosphere and texture and process could drive recordings, could really define the sound of recording. And of course, then he went on to work with U2, etc. in the 80s and still does, frankly. I believe he's a part of the production team for U2's upcoming album. Next guy, Eddie Kramer. As director of engineering for Electric Lady Studio until 1974, he was a pioneering engineer and producer. He captured the explosive sound of late 60s and 70s rock, where it just got big and powerful through innovative mic placement and effects use. So I've mentioned these things before in the tech section. Where you put the mic makes a huge difference. And then, of course, use of effects. You can turn a song into so many things that way and give it a certain feel. His work with Jimi Hendrix, Led Zeppelin's Physical Graffiti, which I learned last year that the front building on that cover of that Physical Graffiti album is down in the East Village, and there's now a place at the ground floor of that building called Physical Graffiti, TEA, that sells like tea and coffee and stuff. And I haven't been there. I've been to the Village dozens, a couple hundred times. I got to go there. That should be fun. He also worked on Song Remains the Same. He worked with Kiss, and he helped define the raw power but also spatial depth of hard rock recordings. And then Alan Parsons, somebody, if you know music history, you hear about him. If you grew up when I did, the first thing you think of is, I can read your mind, I am the eye in the sky, because Alan Parsons Project had that big hit in the 1980s, and I am hoarse now, so I'm not singing well, but screw you, don't judge me. But he did a lot more than that. He got his start working with the Beatles and the Hollies, and then became a 1970s production powerhouse. He blended technical precision with artistic vision and became synonymous with pristine, immersive production. His work on Dark Side of the Moon and with the Alan Parsons Project and so many other artists emphasized sonic detail, cohesion through the album, conceptual cohesion, and early use of studio experimentation to help further the narrative of an album. And then a couple more here in the rock section. You have Roy Thomas Baker, best known for his work with Queen. He pushed multi-track recording to quote-unquote operatic extremes, pun intended. He used every track, probably 24 at that point. His dense vocal layering, dramatic dynamics, willingness to embrace excess, bigness, turned rock records into theatrical experiences, influencing arena rock and pop rock production aesthetics in general. And he continued past the 70s with artists like Guns N' Roses, Foreigner, Ozzy, Devo. Todd Rundgren, close to my hometown, South Jersey. He's a true auteur, and I talked about auteurs in my bonus episode from the 60s. He was one of the most forward-thinking producers of the 1970s, redefining what it meant to be both an artist and a producer, and self-producing. He frequently wrote, performed, engineered, and produced entire records himself, demonstrating an unprecedented level of creative control and anticipating the modern DIY bedroom producer model, which is me and hundreds of thousands of others. Albums such as Something Anything, A Wizard, A True Star fused pop craftsmanship with radical studio experimentation, tape manipulation, and genre-fluid structures. You know I like genre fluidity. As a producer for other artists, including Badfinger, Grand Funk Railroad, said to be one of the most successful artists of the 1970s, New York Dolls, Hall & Oates, and Bat Out of Hell from Meatloaf, Rundgren proved equally capable of delivering commercial impact and artistic ambition, something that I try to do. His work blurred the boundaries between songwriter, producer, and technologist, influencing generations of musicians who view the studio not just as a recording space, but as an instrument of creation. In college, I played a recording for some of my sophomore roommates, and one of the guys was like, "Oh, you sound like Todd Rundgren." And at the time, I was like, whatever, bang on the drum all day, not knowing the depth of his work. So that was actually a compliment, and if you're listening, I don't even know if you're live. Thank you. Couple more guys. Tony Visconti. Actually, it's the last guy in rock before we take a break. Tony Visconti was a defining architect of 1970s art rock, blending emotional immediacy with bold experimentation. He had a long-running collaboration with David Bowie, the man who sold the world, Diamond Dogs, Young Americans, Low, Heroes. He helped push rock production into avant-garde territory while remaining deeply human, song-focused, grounded, accessible. All of those things together. He embraced unconventional recording techniques such as multi-mic, eventide assisted drum processing, and ambient room capture, and drew heavily from European experimental music and funk and soul. And his work demonstrated that innovation did not require abandoning melody or accessibility. This is why he was such a genius, influencing generations of producers working where art intersects pop and technology, and continued to have major impact through the 1980s. That's it for the first half of this episode. The brand new mid-roll is coming up. Stay tuned, and in about a minute and a half, we're going to get into the next section of music and the great producers there. Hey, MxG fans, thank you as always for watching and listening. Listeners, go to youtube.com/@musicisnotagenre. You get a video for every episode of this podcast. Watchers, go to nickdimatteo.com/musicisnotagenre if you would rather just listen. And everyone, please take some time out to go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to support this podcast, my band rec, and everything I do for as little as $1 a month. Speaking of everything I do, nickdimatteo.com really does have it all. If you're interested in unique and quirky t-shirts that I've all personally hand-designed, go to nickdimatteo.com/shop, and you can find it all there, including discounts if you sign up for my newsletter or Patreon. If you're someone who's always wanted to write a song, has just never figured out how to get there, let me work with you. I am the Song Coach. Go to nickdimatteo.com/thesongcoach, and whether you're a complete beginner or completely advanced, I can get you there. You can book a free 30-minute call right there on the site. And of course, I am always releasing new music. Go to nickdimatteo.com/music to find it all. My complete discography is there. All of the social links are there. And of course, please like, share, subscribe, rate, review. Do it for the podcast. Do it for the music. Sharing is especially valuable to all of us indie creators. I really appreciate your support, your eyes and ears. Thank you for hanging with me for this mid-roll, and let's get back to the show. All right, we are back, and two things. How'd you like the new mid-roll? Fun, right? Now I don't have to repeat that stuff every episode. And second thing is, for those of you watching, I try to do a period-specific shirt. So this is sort of a 1970s shirt. I even have my collar unbuttoned the way you might have in the 1970s, that extra button undone. Yeah, fun stuff. So let's get back into the great producers. And this next global genre is jazz, fusion, and progressive music. Here's a guy I mentioned for the 1960s episode. Which, by the way, on the break, I took a sip of water, which was necessary because my, mouth was dry. But also, it makes it a lot harder to, suppress bodily urges, let's say. But I'm going to work on that because, like I said, I'm one take Willie. This guy I mentioned in the 60s, who should have maybe mentioned in this decade, Teo Macero, revolutionized jazz production through tape editing and studio manipulation, especially with Bitches Brew, Miles Davis, In a Silent Way also. And he treated recordings as compositional works. So he's somebody whose work I have heard and was not aware that he did it, and now I am. It's kind of why I do episodes like this, to learn more. And hopefully you do too. Creed Taylor, founder of CTI Records, he polished jazz into a crossover art form, slick, spacious, commercially viable, so smooth jazz and fusion. Fusion, one offshoot of fusion was smooth jazz. You can really say that. And, I have to start my timer, jeepers. And people like Deodato, George Benson, Ron Carter, Jobim, and many others worked with Creed Taylor. Manfred Eicher, founder of ECM, Edition of Contemporary Music Records. His sparse, atmospheric production style emphasized space, silence, clarity, which influenced jazz, classical, and ambient recording aesthetics, new age, and things like that. He worked with Chick Corea, Pat Metheny, Keith Jarrett, and so many others. Let's get into the next section here, funk, soul, and disco. I got to start with these guys because they're hometown heroes. Gamble and Huff, Kenny Gamble and Leon Huff, the architects of the Philadelphia sound, which people to this day still talk about because it was so influential. Lush strings, driving rhythms, and smooth vocal production, which dominated soul and disco throughout the decade and certainly influenced the subsequent decades. People like Harold Melvin and the Blue Notes, the OJs, the Jacksons, Teddy Pendergrass, so many others. The in-house band they worked with, MFSB, Mother, Father, Sister, Brother, although there are people who, said that the MFSB stood for something else, which I would rather this not be an explicit episode. Some of mine are. You see if you can guess what it is. Consisted of over 30 musicians and was basically the wrecking crew or funk brothers of Philadelphia soul. They really are what helped to create that, and maybe in some ways co-produced it. Norman Whitfield, again, mentioned him in the 1960s. I think he should have been, saved for the 1970s, so he deserves a mention here. And his most impactful sonic work was probably in the 1970s. He pushed Motown into psychedelic soul and funk. His aggressive grooves, extended arrangements, a little bit more progressive and expansive, and social commentary redefined soul music's ambition. Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers, we know Freak Out, the Freak, says Chic. They were Chic's creative core, and of course they worked with other artists as well, but even if they hadn't, just the work they did with Chic, with that minimalist funk disco production, tight grooves, clean guitar work, they were not treacly at all, rhythmic precision. It became the blueprint for future dance music. Another blueprint dude, Giorgio Moroder, an Italian, he was an architect of the electronic offshoot of disco, building on what was started in Philly. His synth-driven productions for Donna Summer introduced mechanized rhythms and sequenced bass lines that directly influenced techno, house, synth pop, or any EDM. I Feel Love was a pioneering record in so many ways. Blondie's Call Me also deserves a mention. Then one more in this section, George Clinton, the genius, the master. As the creative force behind Parliament Funkadelic, Clinton fused funk, rock, psychedelia, and Afrofuturism into a singular sonic universe, mixing of genres, layered, chaotic, yet controlled productions. It expanded funk's scale, its humor, and its conceptual ambition, and it influenced hip-hop, sampling, West Coast G-funk, alt R&B, Prince, and other auteurs like that. Had to mention George Clinton. Next section, pop and singer-songwriters. Just a couple here. Arif Mardin was a master of elegance and musical intelligence. He bridged jazz sophistication with pop and soul accessibility, which was a very present thing, especially in the mid-late 70s and early 80s. His productions for Aretha Franklin, the Bee Gees, Diana Ross, and Chaka Khan emphasized clarity, dynamic arrangements, and emotional nuance, helping define the refined radio-ready sound of 1970s R&B and pop, which became 1980s R&B. Was a huge factor in developing the Bee Gees' funk, soul, dance sound that would, of course, propel them to their greatest commercial heights. And then Richard Perry, who specialized in pristine radio-friendly pop productions for people like Carly Simon and Ringo Starr, and his work defined the sound of 1970s sophisticated mainstream pop. And then we get to early hip-hop and urban recording. This was the term that was of the day that was used. Some people consider that a loaded term, but, most terms are loaded. You have Lee Scratch Perry, who was really more reggae, dub, experimental music, but very influential for hip-hop and those kinds of genres. One of the most radical producers of the decade. He worked with Bob Marley. He transformed the mixing console into an instrument. His dub innovations, heavy bass, echo, dropouts, spatial manipulation, all things that I use all the frickin' time. He reshaped reggae and directly influenced electronic music, remix culture, hip-hop production, sound system aesthetics, but also lots of pop and rock. DJ Kool Herc gets an honorable mention. He's widely credited as hip-hop's originator. He introduced the breakbeat technique, isolating and extending drum breaks on vinyl to energize dancers, which then got toasters up to start saying things, and that's what became hip-hop. Though not a traditional studio producer, his innovations laid the rhythmic and cultural foundation for all subsequent hip-hop recording and production. Speaking of, Afrika Bambaataa, who was the more electro side of hip-hop from very early on. He was founder of the Universal Zulu Nation. He expanded the hip-hop's musical scope with those electronic and global influences, even, mimicking Kraftwerk and things like that. His embrace of drum machines and synths, Planet Rock would be the song you would know, linked hip-hop to electro, techno, and future electronic genres. And other than a few exceptions like The Roots and quite a few others these days and throughout the years, when we think of hip-hop now, it's almost synonymous with electronic music. And in many ways, we have Bambaataa to thank for that. Grandmaster Flash, have to mention him, technical innovator. He elevated DJing into a precise mechanical art form, quick mix theory, backspinning, punch phrasing, all these things that became widely used, structured recordable hip-hop, influencing production, beat making, and live performance. I have many of his albums on cassette, actually. And then the final in this section, as promised, Sylvia Robinson. She was the founder of Sugar Hill Records and producer of Rapper's Delight, 1979 single by the Sugar Hill Gang. She helped move hip-hop from live block parties into the recording studio, which made it commercially viable and shaped that form. Without her insistence and pressure, there would be no The Message, is what Grandmaster Flash contends. This was the first record of its kind where the DJ who was the cornerstone of hip-hop at the time in the 1980s was not involved in creating a track that they performed. So that's like production of hip-hop, which I did do an entire episode on the history of hip-hop production. It's in my playlist on YouTube for producers, and just look it up, History of Hip-Hop Production, Music is Not a Genre. And also, don't forget my bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/music is not a genre about Sylvia Robinson. She did far more than what I just mentioned there, and you can find out all of that if you check out the bonus at patreon.com/music is not a genre. So let's get to some conclusions. I'm going to start by stopping something. While I can and will mention my favorite producers of every decade, I can no longer list my favorite albums and songs because there are just too many. And if that's true now in the 70s, there's going to be more and more and more in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. Before I get to my faves, let's summarize the biggest impacts the music production in the 1970s made. Some of these are things I mentioned, some not. Multi-track recording. 16 to 24 track becomes standard, which allowed greater separation of instruments, overdubbing, and much more experimentation. And it laid the groundwork for the layered, polished productions of the 80s and beyond. I wouldn't exist without it. Improved microphone technology and close miking techniques, which enabled more intimate, detailed recordings, captured more of the detail of the sound. Carried forward into singer-songwriter, R&B, and modern vocal-forward production styles, but also for drums, things like that. Advances in studio effects, reverbs, tape delay, phasing, flanging, expanded the sonic palette. They became stylistic signatures in psychedelic and disco and post-punk. And later, digital emulations did the same thing. This was all analog in the 70s. But I would argue that these kinds of advances have infiltrated all music. Widespread use of synthesizers and electronic keyboards like the Moog, the ARP, the Prophet, introduced entirely new textures and timbres, directly enabled synthpop, late 70s into the 80s, techno, house, new wave, modern electronic music of all kinds, including same drum machines and early rhythm programming like the Roland CR78 and early sequencing, replaced or supplemented live drummers Both, really, even from the beginning. It wasn't just a replacement for live drummers. It was a supplement too, which is something I love to do, mix the electronic with the analog drums. Foundational for disco and hip-hop and EDM and anything that's loop-based. Even some minimalist stuff and lo-fi and all that, the new lo-fi. Heavier emphasis on bass and rhythm, which of course gives the subtitle to this episode. It shifted production priorities toward groove and low-end clarity, which influenced club-oriented mixing and hip-hop and EDM. Rise of the producer as a creative auteur, like Brian Eno, Giorgio Moroder, Quincy Jones, who I haven't mentioned yet because I'm saving him for the next episode in this series. And I'm going to go all through his stuff. He may even do a bonus on him because of his giant history. But the rise of producers and auteurs is something I talked about in the 50s, 60s, whichever. I think the 50s. The self-producing artists started as far back as that, if not further back, but really became, 60s, you certainly had Brian Wilson, people, whatever, but became a thing more than any era in the 1970s and just took off from there. And it shifted production from documentation to artistic construction. You could start to construct and create things in the studio far more than ever before. Producer-led pop, which is what pretty much all pop is now. Electronic and hip-hop cultures in later decades, very influenced. Emergence of dub and remix culture, which is something that, of course, didn't exist really before then, introduced remixing. I talked about the first remix many years ago on this show, having to do with what happened to disco after disco was not disco, but it was still disco, whatever. And that book, Last Night a DJ Saved My Life, I think I talked about it in that one too. Different versions of songs, studio manipulation became creative acts and not just let's put out an alternative version to, sell more records. Directly shaped DJ culture, remix aesthetics, and modern production workflows like seriously. Rex remix to You're Right, the No Fun Pushy mix I put out a couple of months ago. I wouldn't be doing things like that if not for this development in the 70s. The development of concept albums and studio constructed works. Because this is not an album series, I didn't talk a lot about concept albums and prog. But of course, that was a huge development in this decade. Albums themselves became cohesive sonic statements, probably more than ever before or after, rather than just collections of songs in progressive rock and art pop and other experimental genres. The growth of independent and regional studio scenes, which encouraged distinctive local sounds like Philly soul, Munich, German disco, electronic, dub from Kingston, which influenced genre hybridity and pop trends that picked things up from other areas of the world. Now, you might say, yeah, but if you know the history of recorded music, you know that all stuff like that, all recording studios and labels started out local before they became a national thing, and that those local labels persisted through every decade. True. But by the time the 1970s hit, it was possible to disseminate this more. And so it became a more influential thing. And of course, since then, it then expanded and then contracted and then exploded into what's happening on the internet. Longer track lengths and extended mixes, especially in disco and other experimental electronic music. It has been said, and I said it on a previous episode, that disco was actually more influenced by progressive rock than you would realize. This responded to club environments where people wanted to dance more and didn't want those breaks. And it foreshadowed DJ-centric formats and 12-inch singles, modern dance structures where you have a long intro that does nothing, and then it does a slight change, and then that goes on for a while. And then the song, instead of a 2 or 3 minute song, is 8 minutes, 10 minutes. Early integration of technology and performance identity. So musicians increasingly define themselves through sound design and studio technique. Think of Todd Rundgren. Anticipating the tech-driven artist identities of the 1980s to present. Think of George Clinton. So a global conclusion for the 1970s is that it transformed the studio into an instrument. It normalized electronic and producer-led creation and established many of the structural, sonic, and cultural foundations that modern pop, hip-hop, electronic, and experimental music still rely on to this day. Now, does that mean the 70s were the best era ever for recorded music? No. Why do I say that? Because pick a decade and I will still say no. Because the range of recording from the 1970s on, in terms of quality, has been the same. In terms of qualitative sound, sure, it shifted. That's what makes eras and genres and various changes, and it dates things or makes things, universal, whatever. But every decade from the 70s, when the full, palette of development for recorded music, other than some digital things that would come later, was established, there is no decade where you can say that was the best ever. There's a difference between having achieved most or all of the elements necessary to create modern recordings and that era being an objective peak. And the misconception has to do with the fact that 1970s production values were on the whole much warmer and fleshed out and used more of the sonic spectrum both in frequency and panning. And while that did create some absolutely classic and wonderfully sounding albums, and many people prefer the sound of that production era, it by no means that the overall quality of that decade's production is categorically better than the overall quality of any subsequent decade's production, which of course we'll get into those production values as the series progresses. But an example, let's take the 1980s. I would argue that the 1980s had both significant advancements in music production that would shape all of music to come, while at the same time did probably do an overcorrection of the warm mid-range 1970s recordings and super pumped up the treble. If you know something about 80s production, I'm really talking mid to late 80s, very trebly. And that's what happens in every decade. There's an overcorrection. But there are still recordings in every decade that you could say are the best recordings ever. And that would set new standards for years to come. Which leads me to two conclusions. One, and I just said this, but it deserves repeating. Every decade from the 1970s on can make the case to be one of the best for recording quality. Every decade has made advancements as well as overcorrections. Every decade has idiosyncrasies that help define its sound, place it in its era. So every decade has its fans. You, as an audiophile, may be a fan of 1970s production values, but that doesn't mean it was categorically the best. Sorry. And number two, and again, I'd argue that if you are a big fan of how 70s music sounds, you're very likely hearing the major difference in overall clarity and bass presence from the previous decade, the 1960s. And since this was the first time that leap was made in history, it may make the impression that it was the best as well, because it was such a change. And many people do believe first is best. Oh, somebody did that thing, and that no one else had done it before, to that degree at least, to that prominence or with that kind of impact, then that's the best. Like the first band to pioneer a genre shift, etc., Velvet Underground. I plan to do a whole episode on the concept of is first best later on. I don't know if it's this season or not, but it's on my list. So the final conclusion is that whether or not you think the 70s were the best decade, they were absolutely incredible, and quite possibly had the largest chunk of recording and producing advancements of any decade. I would say that notwithstanding the digital changes in the 80s with new effects and expansion of recording in different ways, recording formats like the CD, and then the 90s where digital became the standard in studios, those are huge changes. But I would still say in terms of quantity, the 1970s had more, recording advancements than any other decade before or since. My favorite producers from most of the categories I mentioned are coming up now, as promised. Some don't apply. I wasn't, necessarily into the work of, Arif Mardin and Richard Perry. Like there's certain categories I'm just not even going to mention, but let's go through the ones that do, that are favorites of mine. So in the rock, general rock category, it's honestly a tie between Tony Visconti and Brian Eno. They are very different, so they're almost not in the same category. And the things they did complemented each other in, future incarnations. Though I have periodically been into Led Zeppelin and still respect them, I would not count Page as a favorite producer for several reasons. Visconti and Eno are the tie there. In the funk, soul, disco category, I'm not going to lie, this was hard. So, the hell with it. I'm going to go with 3-ish, which means probably 4 favorites. Gamble and Huff, come on, hometown heroes. I was once in their studio, actually, which is very cool to see. And you can't deny how amazing their work was. Bernard Edwards and Nile Rodgers are a personal favorite because I remember as a kid buying the single, the 45 actually, Le Freak, and being like, this is one of my favorite songs ever. And it still is. And that kind of minimalist funk is something I've enjoyed through Prince and through so many other artists after that and some of the work I do. And, of course, George Clinton, the master. Anybody who's going to talk about music production better talk about George Clinton. But you can't not mention Giorgio Moroder either because of his massive influence. The only reason he's a more of an honorable mention is because he didn't work with as many artists and he didn't do as much other than beyond his own work. But what he did do was so impactful, he has to be mentioned. In the hip-hop section, I have several albums, as I mentioned, from Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five, so he probably wins as far as the production values of, the late 1970s hip-hop, which really he didn't have an impact till the 80s, but I thought he deserved a mention here. But of course, I got to give an honorable mention to the pioneer Sylvia Robinson, who is what? Also the subject of my bonus MxTRA at patreon.com/musicisnotagenre. And yes, I did say extra for some reason. So please go to patreon.com/musicisnotagenre to check out the bonus MxTRA on Sylvia Robinson. And speaking of hip-hop, it's time for the featured song. So before I get to this song, why am I choosing a hip-hop song to represent my 1970s influence as opposed to more rock or progressive or dance-oriented songs in my catalog? I could have chosen Wonder Wonder or Ripe or You Make Me Wanna, which could equally have been said to have been 70s influenced. Well, here's why. Even though I have a pretty thorough knowledge of 1970s music, it's never been my biggest touchstone. It's one of those touchstones that I can't define because I was too young to understand what I was absorbing. So it has influenced me in ways I don't even know, but I do not strive to emulate the sound or production values. Not that that's a bad thing. People who do, I find that music wonderful, neo soul and stuff like that. Except for the very late 70s, 78 to 82, as I've mentioned, is one of my production sweet spots. So since hip-hop has influenced me greatly, there was no question this had to be the choice. Now, why do I say that? I have been creating hip-hop since hip-hop has been on the radio, and that is no exaggeration. When I was a child, I was writing lyrics on, lined school paper, and I have lyrics from from the beginnings of hip-hop on the radio, not worth sharing other than to show that I was already learning how to mimic the cadence of the day. My first hip-hop demo was with a friend of mine in high school, senior year, when I was called Nicky D. It's on SoundCloud somewhere. My first pro hip-hop recording was my senior year of college, is a song called Voices in My Head, which was actually 24 tracks of my voice. So there's the pun there. It was all a cappella. It was me imitating drums and bass and guitar and keys and all of that stuff, and then singing, of course. And so that was my first ever, so it was a long time ago that I've been putting hip-hop on recording on wax. I took a break on recording hip-hop for a while until Rek's first album, Parts and Labor, on which I did a cover of Aqua Teen Hunger Force, the theme song to that, which is still, for whatever reason, at least on Spotify, my most played song. It's not my most played song ever. That is also from that same album. It's a song called Gold. But Aqua Teen Hunger Force is pretty popular on Spotify, so if you want to look up nickdamadio.com/discography and then check out Parts and Labor, you'll hear that song. In the between years, between Parts and Labor and my college recording, hip-hop was still influencing both my recording style and the way I would set up lyrical rhymes, and still does, even in my non-hip-hop songs. I would include electronic elements and certain breaks and certain ways I would say or phrase things that were hip-hop influenced even in non-hip-hop songs. I then, after Parts and Labor, included some kind of hip-hop on every Rec release, all of which I've shared before, right up to Rec's most recent album, the song All Caps on Kite to Camden, the song Way Too Rough on Kite to Camden. I think there might be one other that has some hip-hop in there. Eat Salvation, yeah. This week's featured song is from an EP off of my Weird Objective series of albums and EPs that I released called Syncope for the Weird. And the song, that's the name of the EP, and the song is called Let It Wreck Your Mind. This is a throwback, but to several eras. It's meant to have kind of a loosey-goosey feel that somehow is also tight and somehow able to evoke different periods of hip-hop, including the contemporary one. It's got some neo-soul, some glitch hop, alt hip-hop, electro hip-hop. It's got some rock. It's an internal reflection on how life can be so overwhelming that you can't sort through your thoughts enough to express them, and that the answer might be to allow life to overwhelm and inhabit you, which will open you to new possibilities of expression. And that in order to do this, you have to say, I took one for me, which is one of the repeated lines there, meaning believe in yourself and what you do and give yourself what you need to do for others and for the world. Please click the link that I always include, stream it, like it, playlist it, wherever you listen to music, and then stay tuned. In a minute, you're going to hear the song. Questions. Do you agree that the 1970s production values were head over heels above those of previous decades? Do you believe it was the best decade for production? What are some of your favorites from the decade? Genres, producers, artists, albums, songs. How do you think music production from this decade influenced subsequent decades? I want to know the answers to these and all other questions because, as always, my objectives here are music, conversation, and connection. Thank you for hanging with me for part 3 of the Great Producer series, and I will talk to you next week.
I gotta have something to say, but I'm not thinking straight. I'm blinking 8 times a second, cause life is wrecking my mind. Life is wrecking my mind.
Remember that the root note, but bass follows.
I'm not just a wannabe, I'ma feel it. Music is a part of me and I'ma reveal it. I put it out for the world, I don't care if you steal it. Open that seal and let it wreck your mind. Let it wreck your mind. Step if you're not gonna go for it. Give it all you got or you get nothing to show for it. Be ready to take every body blow for it. Open yourself and let it wreck your mind. took one for me. I've been waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting
Life
and
is
waiting
wrecking
for
my
no
mind.
one, nobody is gonna show some love to me. If I've been hating and hating and hating and hating on what I gotta give, what I wanna get. But until I got that set, I'm gonna make the safer bet. I'll take one for me. I'm an imitator, innovator. An imitator, innovator. I took one for me. Let it wreck your mind. I took one for me. Let it wreck your mind. I took one for me. Let it wreck your mind. I took one for me. Let it wreck your mind. Let it wreck your